Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode 37. This is actually episode 37 now this time. I am joined again by Maggie Parke and Ben Davis. We're not all in the same place today, unfortunately, but we're joining you. And in fact, Maggie isn't actually even in a place right now. She's in the in-between place.
Ether.
Yeah, it's sort of like the wood between the worlds in The Magician's Nephew. That's kind of where Maggie's joining us from. She's actually literally in the middle of moving house right now, which is why she is broadcasting on her laptop with no microphone and
no mic, no light.
Yeah.
In the dining room off my sister-in-law's kitchen, and I know the dogs are going to lose it when they get home. So if I go on mute, that's why. Yeah, I'm very much in the in-between of my life. So thanks, guys. I'm glad to be here and thinking about the move and talking about Aragorn.
We are just grateful to have you with us here today. Your presence is. I just wanted to emphasize how heroic your presence is here today, so that people understand.
I texted Corey like an hour ago, being like, "We just dropped off the keys. I'm 45 minutes away. I should be there almost on time." Yeah. So we're currently homeless. We're moving into our new place in like 2 weeks. So we're staying with my sister-in-law for a couple weeks. So it's been a ride, folks.
Yeah.
It's been a ride.
It's been a ride. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Well, so we were last time. I mentioned the my crack about the actual episode 37. Of course, many of you will remember, those of you who are attending live may remember our attempt to broadcast. We had technical difficulties last time and didn't end up being able to recover it. So we ended up having to scrap the stub of an episode that we were able to do last time. So we're going to go back and address that topic because it's one that we've been really excited to discuss. We're returning to our discussion of the Peter Jackson films. We've been systematic, but we've been deliberate in looking at different elements of the Peter Jackson adaptation.
We've been more structured than we usually are.
Yeah, exactly. Because of course the Peter Jackson adaptation of The Lord of the Rings deserves more than just a one or two off episode, talking about it. So we're looking at different elements of it. And again, one of the goals of this is that having spent some time now, having spent, the better part of a year discussing adaptation and thinking about what this looks like and how it works and some of the factors involved, there's some reasons why we've waited this long to talk about the Peter Jackson films, I think, in some ways, and really focusing on how do we apply that. Let's now look back at the Peter Jackson adaptation, which I think is, you can still see a lot of ways in which the approach to the Peter Jackson films is often still problematic, whether it's from Tolkien fans who are still resistant to them, which there are still many of those that exist, or whether it's people who grew up with them and who think about them quite differently. And I mean, it was one thing that I was noticing certainly when during Rings of Power season last year, the very different ways in which people were approaching the Peter Jackson films and the Rings of Power. So we're thinking about the Peter Jackson the Peter Jackson films. Alana, that's a wonderful thing to say. Alana says, this broadcast has completely changed the way that I look at any TV show or film. That's wonderful to hear. This has been such a learning process for me as well. I also have had my perspective very significantly changed as we have been working through these things. Just taking the time to think through what is going on. It is so easy to not think about it. But anyway, all right, so let's talk. So today we're talking about Aragorn, the character of Aragorn. We've been looking at a few major characters. We talked about Elrond, we talked about Galadriel. We're still focusing mostly on the Fellowship of the Ring. We're not going to pretend the other two films don't exist, but we're still really wanting to focus on how these things get established in the Fellowship of the Rings film. Oh, and I didn't mention, we're also joined by Ben Davis over here from Studio Lab in Terry. He's was of course the director of Rings and Realms, and was with us last time when we
tried to discuss this together.
Yes, tried and failed. But anyway, So Aragorn.
We did discuss this together. You guys just didn't get to see it.
Exactly. We had a good discussion.
We went for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are, in talking about Aragorn's character, there's an interesting contrast between looking at the depiction of Aragorn in The Fellowship of the Ring and looking at the depiction of Galadriel, which was the last conversation that we had about the Peter Jackson films. Because very few Tolkien readers, when they saw, Cate Blanchett's depiction of Galadriel in The Fellowship of the Ring, were like, oh my gosh, they changed so much. Like, wow, there was very little temptation, right? I mean, there are things you might, dislike or disagree with. There are lots of interesting things to notice. And we were talking about that there are some actually fairly profound changes that they make, especially to her temptation moment in the film, more even than a lot of people remember. However, the Aragorn depiction is in a quite different category. The Aragorn depiction, certainly when The Fellowship of the Ring came out and was the only thing that any of us had seen, I think it's fair to say that Aragorn was at the absolute top of the list of like things that Tolkien fans were struggling with when they were looking at this adaptation. The changes made to Aragorn's character are far more profound than the changes made to Galadriel's character or even to Elrond's character. And it was something that a lot of Tolkien fans had a hard time grappling with when it came out. So this is in some ways kind of one of the weightier and trickier topics to that we've discussed yet when it comes to the Peter Jackson films. But I don't want to start from that perspective. Right. I don't want to start with the first let's talk about everything they got wrong about Aragorn. Like that's not the point, right?
Let's talk about the story they told.
Let's talk about the story they told. So Maggie, why don't you talk about what you see as as sort of important or effective or interesting about the role of Aragorn in that first film? Like, if you were trying to explain to somebody who didn't know the movie, right? Like, what is essential to Aragorn's role in that story? What are the things that you would emphasize?
I feel like there's two ways to look at that. So one is knowing story structure and outlines and archetypes and all that kind of stuff, that if the hobbits had just crossed over the first major threshold and we're now in the world of men and we've seen that it is other, they're at the lower door, not the high door, getting into the breathe. If they're at the lower door, we've got hobbit-sized beds, like they are the other now.
Yes.
So now that they've kind of crossed that first threshold and we're in this other world, sorry, the dog's scratching his collar. I am then introduced to Aragorn / Strider, mysterious, creepy dude in the corner of the bar. I'm immediately suspicious, but also incredibly curious because it's introducing this new factor in this new world that's going to definitely change the trajectory of whatever they're on. We just don't know what it is yet. So just as like a tool, it's a red flag, or it's not red because it's not a warning, but it's a gold glittery shiny flag for me to be like, interesting, we've got something here.
Right.
So like if you're aware of the story type, I think that idea is really interesting. And who we get is this like unknown, secret, mysterious, brooding type. The lighting is beautiful on his eyes.
Yeah,
like
the red glow on his face, right?
Just this little hint, the slow kind of, yeah. So then the other way of looking at this, I think, is just like general standard moviegoer, right? Like, I don't know any of this stuff, but I know that the people I've been following in the safe little space are now not in a safe little space. So it's fun to put the structure on it and be like, oh, this guy is an implement for storytelling because he's going to change the trajectory. He's going to enter us into the next quadrant of action, Yeah. But it doesn't really matter if you know the structures or not. I just find that kind of fun. But I think it's the same either way.
If I could add quickly to that I wasn't really thinking about this until you mentioned that, but that idea of him as that kind of transitional figure, I think of him grabbing Frodo, like he physically picks Frodo up and hauls him into another room, right? And he's taking him out of danger that moment, right? But there is that. I mean, the way in which he serves as the character who brings the hobbits like across that threshold, right, is almost literalized in how he, I mean, like we just see a hand grabbing Frodo, and then the next cut is to Frodo being plopped in the room, right? So he literally changes the scene. And brings Frodo from one place to another, and so I think I'm just kind of piling on that we can, that role seems to be something that they really leaned into.
But that's also such a good point to point out, though, because it takes him from being this like subtle, mysterious dude in the corner to being very proactive of like, nope, you are mucking this up, and I'm going to tell you why. And then he's also this other because he has information and he's going to enlighten us. So not only is he mysterious, moving them forward, but now he's an informative being as well. So he fulfills a lot of roles in that one little moment.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, he becomes almost like the only other figure that we've had, apart from, I guess, Galadriel's voice in the voiceover at the beginning in the prologue, who was that kind of like, I have all the information and can give you exposition kind of figure, was Gandalf, right? And now Strider is in that sort of quasi Gandalf role, except he's a little scarier and less dependable because we don't get. Whereas with Gandalf, we were introduced to Gandalf by the flying hug from Frodo, right? And the obvious affection there. Right. He was accepted, even though, there was that whole business of some of the hobbits not accepting him and stuff. How well known he was.
But that just made me love him more. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, yeah. No, I mean, so we get all the warm fuzzies about Gandalf as our way to introduce his character. So when he starts, even when he and Bilbo are having their tense moment, right? Nevertheless, he is this figure that we are informed that we can trust. Whereas with Strider, we get the opposite of that. But now he's in that Gandalfian role, right? And yet without any of that foundation, in fact, something like the opposite of that foundation.
Yeah, no, it's interesting then to just, when he does become out of his depth, not even that long after we meet him, it's that much more powerful, right? Because we're like, oh, good, we have this person who's kind of like telling us some backstory, and he knows a bunch of stuff, and then it's like, oh, I can't heal this wound. You're like, okay, this is serious. Like, helps reinforce that.
But he knows
Strider doesn't know what to do.
Yeah, right. But he knows how to do it too. So you're like, ooh, Kingsfell, the weed, ooh, Atlas played, wait, what? The fact that he's able to like pull that knowledge out, you're like, oh, there's a lot more there.
Right.
Love that.
Yeah, and yet he can't do anything. So yes, it's a way of, and isn't that a fascinating turning point? Like that's the point where I'm trying to figure out what, like, the kind of cues we get as viewers, right? We're clearly getting all of these, this guy is kind of sketchy cues from his introduction, right? When is the moment when we turn around as viewers and are like, oh, I completely trust Strider. He's totally a good guy and absolutely reliable, right? Like, when exactly does that happen?
Do you think it takes that long, Weathertop?
That for me, that was like, I would watch that scene. I was a freshman in college and I illegally downloaded it on my computer. I watched that scene so many times because for me, that was the moment where he crossed over to being the ultimate protector and stepped into that leadership role. There's so many things that were just like, mwah, with that. I definitely trusted him before that, but I feel like that was the moment where it was like, he is my hero.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the first scene Viggo shot when that was like him stepping into the character for the first time.
I love hearing what they do first. Like that's where you started. Wow.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, so because I mean, I when I'm thinking about the his how his character is handled on screen prior to Weathertop, I know, so as Nameless Arcanum was just saying in the comments that the apple chucking scene is one where we see him trying to connect with the hobbits. Yes, but from the other side of the hill, like there's always a physical distance between him and the hobbits, as if they're holding back from him, right? I mean, part of it's just like he's in the lead as they're going and the hobbits are following behind. But it really still looks like the hobbits are a group, and there's Strider out in front. And they're, you know, the kind of tone of voice, like think about the apple conversation, like the second breakfast conversation, right? You know, Merry and Pippin talking to each other, the kind of lowered voices in which they're talking, and then like he overheard them, right? And then the apple chucking, like it shows he's making an effort. It's not that he's reaching out to them, but he's still reaching out to them from a distance. And even that when he like shows up randomly out of nowhere and gives them the swords, right? You know, it's still like, I still do feel that there's doubt up through the Weathertop point about whether or not he's a totally trustworthy dude. But
yeah, it's interesting because I think in the inn, when obviously, you know, he protects them from the Nazgul, right? From coming in and stabbing them. That would certainly indicate that he doesn't want the Nazgul to get them, but I guess you're right. Like, what could there be some sort of third motive? Like, okay, what are their true intentions? That's
well, at that point, that's a really good way to do it too, because I love the way that scene is shot too, because, you know, we think that the hobbits are about to get attacked, and then we pan back and see that they're safely across the way. But that's still such a good way to do it, because all we know is that they got him out of trouble right there. We don't actually know that he's a safe space yet, because maybe he still wants the ring for a different reason and things like that. But
right, and there are ways in which he's not safe. Like, think of his tone of voice, right? You know, like from the openly snarky, like that is a rare gift, right, line to even when he's doing his exposition about the Nazgul, right? There's a certain element, like he's not warm and fuzzy. He doesn't sound like super friendly. I mean, he's telling them, right? But there's something, I don't know. His interactions with the Hobbit still have this edge, right? You know,
begrudgingly almost. I mean, he seems like a little snarly, a little too cool.
A little snarly.
Like, I don't want to be involved in this malarkey, but here I am. You know? There's a little bit of that vibe.
Cold and distant.
Yeah, definitely distant. I don't know exactly like how to characterize it correctly. Like the edge that I'm hearing in his voice when he's talking about the Nazgul. It's not quite condescending. It's not quite grudging. It's not, but there's a little bit of like
disappointed parent.
You know, you guys are annoyingly ignorant, kind of. And again, I'm not trying to say that he's like that, because the reason I'm trying to be cautious is that it's not that I think he's acting like a jerk necessarily, but again, there's, you know, by point of contrast, think of the difference between his whole affect and tone of voice when he kneels before, you know, when he offers Frodo his sword at the Council of Elrond, right? Or when he you know, kneels before Frodo and closes his hand over the ring at the end of the movie, right? The kind of warmth that we see from his character, the you know, the like love and respect for Frodo, like none of those things are there. Like he's and honestly, I think that they are here doing justice by an important element in the book. The whole Bree sequence in the book, Strider is absolutely on guard. Like he does not trust the hobbits, you know, he tells them he doesn't trust them. Like this could have been a trick. And he's like, I'm totally like gambling here by like revealing myself to you, but like, what the heck, you know, let's have a go. So yeah, I definitely think that there's still, to me, it's even, like the Weathertop confrontation, like the fight scene, you know, him fighting off the Nazgul is obviously a huge deal. To me, the healing scene is even, and as far as like, because he is mostly interacting with people by throwing torches in their faces during the Weathertop scene. In the post-Weathertop scene, his interactions with the hobbits, I think, are that's where we can see a change.
Yeah.
And again, they're tracking with the book there. Sam still has his doubts about Strider, right, after Weathertop. And we're told there it's not until they meet Glorfindel, that Sam's doubts are finally allayed, right? And of course, the meeting of the Glorfindel stand-in and the Weathertop sequence are almost simultaneous, of course, in the film. But
just before that, though, you're right. He brings Sam in, sort of to help. Hey, let's go look for Athalas. Like, okay, we're in this together.
Yeah.
And uses the name that Sam would understand too, which I love. Kingsful, it's a weed. So that juxtaposition too of like, the Athalas, the Elvish word, like that could be snooty if he just left it at that.
Yeah.
But no, he brought it down to Sam and said, no, Kingsful. Oh yeah, I know that one. It's a weed. All right, let's find it. It became like a mission.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Nameless Arcanum was saying exactly that thing as you said that. Yes, absolutely. I think it's the way that they distance him and show him being distanced seems an important element. And then, of course, we don't really think about, like we've been focusing here about his interaction with the hobbits. Think about like what we learn about him as a character on his own, right? Not as a device, Maggie, as you were saying, he begins as a sort of device in the journey of the hobbits, right?
Yeah.
But
then the reveal of him, exactly like how they reveal the elements, I think is really well done. That it starts as a device that's just mysterious and gets us to move, sure, but then he has knowledge, then he has action, then he's protective, then he has elvish knowledge, then he has medicinal knowledge, and he has historical knowledge. Like there's a load of stuff going on and you're like, you are not just a ranger,
right?
And at that point we don't even know what rangers are, but we kind of can assume from the term and everything else of what that role means,
right?
And some sort of a wild man. But this is not just a wild man. There's something else in there that keeps piquing our interest.
And then we meet Arwen, right? And that I would say the first moment, you can tell me if you think I'm right about this, the first moment where we begin to get any sense of his like interior life, of him as a character, other than how he relates to the hobbits, is the scene in the extended edition when he's singing the song, when he gives the shortest Beren and Luthien paraphrase ever, which I'm still a huge fan of. She died, right? That's the Beren and Luthien story in 2 words. But you literally can't do a shorter version. I mean, maybe the only way you can do a shorter, I have a 1-word summary. Escape. There we go. That's it. But that doesn't really do very much. She died is a better one. Anyway, so that we don't get much, right? But we get at least the idea of like there is some interiority happening there that is independent of the hobbits or their journey or what is going on, right? And of course, it doesn't get built on, right? It doesn't pay off until we meet Arwen, and that's the beginning, really, of his true unfolding as a character. What do you feel like that does? The scene with Arwen, where Arwen finds him, and catches him off his guard, which is lovely and works in so many ways. I want to hear Ben's
answer to that, but like that moment too, I feel like was really important. Of what's this? A ranger caught off his guard, like immediately puts her in this relationship to him where she's mocking him and judging him and kind of joking with him. So it's such a lovely introduction because it covers a lot of ground. It catches him off his guard. We introduce a new character, but also we know that she knows something about him and is kind of poking fun to him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it definitely sort of sets him in a sort of, I don't know, preteen me was very much about this power hierarchy, right? So it's like, okay, oh my gosh, Shredder's here. He's awesome. He's so cool. And then it's like, oh, we got elves are like even here. Like they caught him off guard. It does a lot to sort of put him in, not in his place, but, situate a perspective.
To situate him in context.
Immediately following, their interactions.
Totally.
Humanizes him. And I think it's that first, even... it's interesting, the scene, the extended scene where he's singing, Beren and Luthien, still is very sort of cold and distant. And you kind of got this glimpse, but maybe it's just because it's sad. The first, like, real warmth I feel like we get from him is between him and Arwen. You know, when they first meet, when we first meet them together. Yeah.
Yep. Isn't there a moment too where she reaches up to her or something? I feel like there's a softening moment where like he leans into her hand and
he grabs her hand and says, "Yeah, ride hard."
Yeah, we definitely have not seen that yet. Like he's just business, and he's trying to be friendly and stuff in his Strider way, but he's just business, moving forward. And then you do get that moment of him almost like passing the torch, like, all right, now I can take a moment and ride hard.
Yeah. It's a much softer moment than any. Obviously, you know, we learn that he cares about the hobbits, but it's all very intense. And then for this brief moment, obviously, the music helps with all of this, right? Everything just sort of softens down. We get this tender moment between them.
And I know we're talking about Aragorn, but we also get such a beautiful introduction of the elves because she's so separate to what his current situation is, you know, clean and strong and powerful and beautiful. And you know I'm the faster rider. You know that I can do this better than you can. And, okay. And now it does kind of give you that moment of, game on. We're about to meet something really incredible. And I love the awe from Sam. We're going to meet the elves, you know?
Yeah.
We'll set this up.
First elf that we see other than the prologue, at least in the theatrical version. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I really like, Ben, the point that you were making about the sort of hierarchy there. It does have that kind of building effect I hadn't really thought of it in terms of, especially the catching him off his guard thing, with the kind of putting Strider in his place in that way. But it is true, like, the film does insist that humans are below elves hierarchically in some ways, and that is our very first introduction to this idea that Strider, whose, you know, woodcraftiness has been established by that point, you know, he's the guide and tracker and everything else, and now, but he's one-upped, you know,
right.
But
elves are on another level.
Yeah.
But also you get those little moments where you know that he's part of that world in some way, but we don't know how yet. You know, he speaks the language, he understands where things are, and this needs elvish medicine, we have to get there. And then it's revealed in that wonderful deleted scene that he's spent quite a bit of time there being raised by them. But I'm still surprised we didn't get that in the theatrical, to be honest, because I feel like that explained a lot. That story-wise, I might have prioritized that.
Which scene is
in
that?
My main script.
The one at his mother's grave?
Yes.
I remember watching, I think, I'm sure it was the special features from Fellowship, where one of the concessions they made to shorten the runtime was they decided that the first movie would be Frodo-centric. And so they were like, okay, this is an Aragorn scene, we'll cut that because we just need to focus on Frodo.
Yeah.
Which I think makes some sense when you go back and look at what they added back in.
Yeah.
And we have talked about that a fair bit, the lens of a film, that they pick kind of a through line to push things forward. So, you know, you definitely hear about it with Harry Potter, that Harry Potter is the through line. Everything else is on the cutting board, just why we don't have the House Elves Revolution and all these other elements that people like, but don't affect Harry's storyline.
Yes.
So that totally makes sense for a film like this that's so long and so necessary for a lot of action to happen, to pick someone like Frodo to be your through line.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because, well, I don't know that we need to... The question arises, okay, do we feel like Frodo was the frame for that first movie, or do we feel like men were kind of the frame for that movie?
You know, it's interesting because I can certainly understand their choice to say they want to make the film clearly Frodo-centric and focus on, you know, him as the hero's journey figure, you know, in the film. It makes a lot of sense. But I agree. Like, I think you could make a real argument. Like, imagining being back in that room when they were making that decision, right, way back. I think a really strong counter argument could be made to say, actually, Frodo's not really what this film is about. This film begins, and I said this before when we were talking about Elrond, I think, the weakness of men is the whole thematic frame of this, right? Like we begin with Isildur and his failure, and then we end with Aragorn being explicitly in that place. I mean, the climax of what the film builds up to is Boromir's betrayal and Aragorn's success, right? And then the reconciliation scene with the death of Boromir. The film technically ends with Frodo looking out on the Emyn Muil, right? But that's like an epilogue. That's you know, I feel like the movie is done after the death of Boromir, really. So yeah, I agree with you, Ben. I don't think that, objectively speaking, looking at the film, I don't think that Frodo is really the compelling thematic center of that movie at all.
I wouldn't think he is either, but I think that speaks to the strength of the story as a whole, that it's not obvious that it's Frodo-centric. Like, this would be a really fun essay to set students at the end of a semester, you know, like tell me what the frame is, and there'd be loads of right answers, because I feel like you could play with each of those characters and the necessity of their arc and their actions and what's going on and what's shown and how. I think Frodo and his journey might have been like the bullet points on the left side of the structure page, right? Like, we need Frodo to get to these places, and then everybody else could kind of fit in alongside. So it's not like it was Frodo necessary. Other things could happen to affect Frodo's story.
Right.
But I like that they balanced that as well as they did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to deny. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to deny that the storytelling choices they made were successful. You know, like, so clearly, on some level, the choices they made to focus more on Frodo, and that enabled, I suspect, viewers to connect with the story more readily, and obviously, as a piece of storytelling, that film was very, very successful. And yet I do think that I would not put Frodo's journey as one of the primary things that movie is interested in, really. It's there. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I don't think it's the number one thing.
You think that struggle, the weakness of men, is the number one thing?
Yes. Yeah. I think... Yeah, because I think like the through line almost is less Frodo than the ring, actually. Like the ring and the ring bearer. Because, yeah, like how Frodo connects with that, his relationship with the ring, like that doesn't really come into focus until later, like the Return of the King, basically, you know, as we're getting, you know, it's really not until, well, Two Towers. Once he's in Ithilien and Gollum is there, and we've got the Frodo Gollum ring thing happening, that's where the story, in the films especially, really begins to dig into what effect is the ring having on Frodo? What choices is Frodo making? I mean, yeah, he's making the huge choice to become the ring bearer in the Council of Elrond. It's like, I'm not trying to downplay that entirely, but again, it's less about like who is Frodo and why is he making the choices that he's making. The focus seems to me in the first film to be more on the ring. Yeah,
we're undoing the bad decisions that men made.
Yeah.
That is what we're here to do.
In the first film, yeah. Absolutely. And we get Elrond emphasizing that. We get, Aragorn himself, obviously that, think about the way that the Aragorn Boromir pairing, right, is played up from that first scene in Rivendell with the shards of the sword.
So I love this because it kind of, I think, helps to explain, I don't know if we're ready to get into it yet, but what would probably be considered the largest character departure,
the reluctant
for Aragorn
thing,
is okay. It makes, if this is the central struggle of the entire film, is that men are weak and they screwed up and we're going to undo that. All right, now a reluctant king,
works,
who's concerned that he's going to make the same mistake, makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, and I have a lot of thoughts, and I don't know which one to start with first because they're all very exciting. But I feel like the Frodo storyline I need to think about a bit more as a boring structure base, and that's not a bad thing. you need a good foundation for things to be built off of. And Frodo's is really easy. Mm-hmm. He's a very standard, unlikely hero. Everybody can relate to this. You're very immediately engaged with this character, but it's a very simple understanding. He doesn't change significantly internally. He has a lot of hurts that he has to carry with him, so he's a very different character at the end than he was at the beginning because of a life lived. But he doesn't actually have that sophisticated of an arc, right? Like, his job is to just keep carrying on. Whereas some of these others are way more complicated. And so intriguingly so, you know, and because we have all these different worlds and supernatural elements and other things that we're kind of figuring out alongside, the baseline of Frodo's story is a really good timeline, like bullet point to kind of track everything else along.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should think, like, this is big picture adaptation discussion. I don't think we should think of through line or lens of a film being Frodo or Harry Potter or anything, meaning that they're the most important. It means it's a spine. You know, right. It means it's the spine that things come out from.
Okay, that makes sense. Yes. Okay. And it would make sense then that when I'm thinking about things like the thematic center of the film, it's fine that thematic center isn't necessarily in the same place as the...
Totally.
Yeah.
Because Frodo's line is still going, but the thematic center will be somewhere on his line and will make
it's always going to be near him, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, he is, as far as this theme is concerned, which again I would argue is one of the major themes, possibly the central theme of the Fellowship of the Ring film, the whole weakness of men theme. Frodo is like an object in there, right? I mean, think about how Frodo is positioned between Frodo and Aragorn at the end of the film, right? The one of whom tries to take the ring from him, the other of whom defends him, right? In both cases, Frodo is passive. He's not doing it. He's not making any choices. He's not doing anything.
And he passes out all the time.
he starts keeling over.
Left, right, and center.
Falls down.
It's true.
He just falls down.
And how many times does he die?
Fall down.
How many times has he stabbed through the gut and died? So many times.
Yeah. No, he just hits the ground. You're right. Yeah. It is really Frodo's go-to move, right?
Yeah.
Confronting the Witch King, fall over.
Pass out.
Right. Confronting Boromir, fall over. Right.
And the Witch King one really defies logic too.
Well, he tripped. There was debris.
It could happen to anybody. Yeah. You know. Yeah. Yes. I agree. Yeah. Okay. But I want to go back to the reluctant.
He's an object.
Yeah. He's an object. Yeah. Exactly. But so it makes sense then. He's still the central object, right? And that, I think, is the point that you're making, right? He doesn't have to be the mover of the action. He doesn't have to be, again, the thematic center. He's just the center.
The constant.
Yeah. But back to, Ben, your point about the reluctant king business, because you are right that. So the story that they are emphasizing, like the role that Aragorn plays in the weakness of men theme in the film, where he's starting from is in a sense a position of strength. Like, it's a good sign that he doesn't want to be king. If Aragorn, within the thematic context that we've been given in this film, had we met Aragorn and it was just revealed, Aragorn is the long lost king, and now when we set out from Rivendell, he's going to be going forth to reclaim his inheritance and make himself king. Within the context of the thematic development of the film, that'd be like a huge red flag, right? I mean, maybe he's going to be the one who turns out better than the others, but we'd have all kinds of anxiety about that. Aragorn saying, no, that's not me. And this is like, so if all we'd ever learned was what was in the Council of Elrond, right? The he turned from that path long ago statement. If that's all we got, we didn't know anything about why, right? could have just seemed like a loser, right, or something like it could have just seemed like weakness purely
a high
on
school
his part.
dropout.
Yeah, exactly.
Lazy.
But instead, because we get introduced to this theme in that exchange before the statue, before the shards of Narsil, right, with the Isildur cutting the ring mural in the background, right, and the shards of Narsil in front of him. And I'm thinking here, of course, especially about his conversation with Arwen at the end, right, at the end of that scene. And there he's the one who sort of announces the theme. Okay, hang on, help me remember, folks. Does that scene, his conversation about like the same weakness runs in my veins, right?
The same blood runs in my veins.
Yeah. Does that happen? The same blood, the same weakness, right? That's how he says it, right? Mm-hmm. Is that before or after Grumpy Elrond's "I was there" Gandalf scene?
After.
It's after. So
yeah.
So we set it up. The weakness of men gets set up in the prologue, right? And then we get reminded forcibly of it by Elrond in the "I was there" Gandalf. Men can't be relied upon, right? This is the official eyewitness elf testimony, reality about humans. Then, so if it's after that, then now we see that Aragorn knows this.
He agrees with Elrond.
Yeah, he's totally self-aware of how this works. And so
is removing himself from the equation.
Right, which is therefore now, so instead of making him look like the high school dropout, now this is a position of moral strength, right? Yeah. I don't trust myself because I am wise and humble. I don't trust myself to do this.
And that aligns him with Galadriel, doesn't it? I passed the test.
Absolutely.
Is some of that, I wonder, just like a product of modern storytelling? That he has to be so reluctant and humble.
That was when I went home from the theater after watching The Fellowship of the Ring. That was all I could think of. I was like, oh man, they just made him into like a squeamish, modern, reluctant hero. They stripped Aragorn of all of his like mythic stature, and just instead decide to make him relatable to the uncertain modern person, right? That was what I was grumbling about the day I went home from the theater.
And I didn't feel that at all. I mean, you notice the differences, but I think I've always been quite drawn to the reluctant hero anyway, because it's not a modern thing. It's been around forever, but I do think it's way popular in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah.
Because of that relatable element. But it didn't think it weakened any element of Aragorn to see him be reluctant. It made, when he chose to take up that mantle and say to Boromir, "our people," that hit so much harder.
Yes.
Because of what he had led up to that point. Because of what had led up to that point.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. I mean, this is exactly what I feel. Because again, at the time, I was all just full of the contrast between film Aragorn and book Aragorn, whose very mythic status has always been one of the most important things to me about Aragorn's character, and I still think is one of the most important thing about Aragorn's character in the book. But that's what it blinded me to exactly that, Maggie. They are. I think I would have said, this is me trying to like project back to what I would have said 20 years ago, but I think I would have said that they had made his character weak. And that would have been wrong. Like I would now say that is an utterly incorrect assessment of the film's depiction. Not thinking about the contrast, but thinking about how he's represented in the film. That is his reluctance shows his wisdom and his strength. He is stronger than Boromir, because he doesn't just with confidence think that he like Boromir sort of and again I was already struggling with Boromir turning away and leaving the hilt of Narsil on the floor. I was still like, but Boromir would never do that, holy cow, like how could you possibly but nevertheless, like what they're doing there, showing how Boromir he's moving past these things, right? He's not learning from the lessons of history. He is, and this is going to set him up for the failure that he's going to have later on. Whereas Aragorn, has this totally different perspective. Aragorn is the one who is stronger, even though, Boromir's the one who exudes all the confidence, right? And yet that is that the apparent difference gap in the confidence and outward strength between the two of them belies the real inward strength that they're focusing on and building on. I think that's done really, really well in the film. If I can shut the other voices off long enough to notice that.
Look how far you've come.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying.
So, do you think then it would have been a tougher sell if he was, can you tell a story these days with a hero who's, as proud
right from the start?
Yeah, I don't know.
You can but I feel like that. I mean, I'm thinking superheroes and things like that. Like Tony Stark is always going to be the strong, confident. Trying to think of all those words that are kind of mean, but also true for Tony Stark. So, I feel like you can, but then that becomes quite a defining element of their character. So I feel like with Aragorn, if he came on super strong, kingly at the very beginning, I don't know if I would have liked him as much. And I think it was really important for us to like him. But I also think it was really important for us to not trust him, then love him. There was a real interesting path in our relationship to that character, that if he just came in as king, I don't relate to that. And I guess it's not all about relation too. I don't want to put too much onus on
that's
exactly how the audience feels.
That's exactly where I would place the emphasis. That to me is the major difference. Like when you talk about when we talk about audiences nowadays and a modern perspective, that to me is the fundamental shift. Is that the way the modern mode of digesting stories is to relate ourselves and project ourselves. And that is alien. It's one of the things that makes, as a medieval literature professor, it's one of the things that always makes reading stories of very different periods, like the Middle Ages, fundamentally difficult for, I have, I've taught classes where I have students who are saying things like, but I can't relate to Beowulf. And I'm like, I know, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're not supposed to, nobody reads Beowulf and says, that is me. I am.
No one finds themselves.
No one finds themselves in Beowulf. This is telling my story, right? I'm connected to that. I'm not trying to mock that. That's a perfectly respectable way. That's a powerful way to connect with stories. But that's not the only way of telling stories. It's not the only way of reading stories.
And also the intention, right? The author of Beowulf was not how will my audience like this? They just wrote a story. Whereas now there really is this connection.
It's not that I think that there's no question of considering audience, but it's just what they're considering is something quite different about the audience. And Tolkien was more of that world than of the modern world when it came to storytelling in a lot of ways. He was not on board with the and when I say the modern world, by the way, I'm not just talking about the modern world since Tolkien, right? This is one of the things that has been I blame the novel for this development in modern story reception. Novels have from the beginning, it's been one of the defining elements of novels that they are something that you connect with, rather than, even when they're either completely, that doesn't mean they have to be realistic in the sense of oh, this is a perfectly plausible plot and this could have happened to anybody. They can be, wild, strange adventures of very peculiar people in very unusual circumstances, but nevertheless, still the way in which we sort of connect with them. You read, but even go back to the beginning of the novel, right? You read Robinson Crusoe, and you are very much being invited to be what would it be like to be stranded on a desert island, right? And what would I have to go through, and what would I feel under these circumstances, right? That is the attraction of Robinson Crusoe, the novel, which is one of the first novels, right? Whereas when you're reading Paradise Lost, right, that's not what you're doing. You're not situating yourself in that story in the same extent. Now, there are many people who have read Paradise Lost and in fact saying, I can really relate to Satan, the Satan figure that Milton represents. There are many people who have had that reaction to him, but that's not how the work of art was designed, right? It's not the way it works. Anyway, this is a huge shift. It has become so dominant in the modern world that it's still one of the things in which Tolkien stands out, I think, in a lot of ways, even compared to other contemporary to him. Like if you go back and look at people like George MacDonald or William Morris, who were writing fantasies in the generation before Tolkien. It's not just a chronological thing. It's not just an early 20th century thing. The Princess and the Goblin is still a novel in a way that The Lord of the Rings is not a novel. Which, remember, Tolkien actually always resisted that label. The Lord of the Rings isn't a novel. It's a romance. It's a historical romance, which just means story, basically. So anyway, yeah. So Nameless Arcanum says, aren't we supposed to connect with Frodo, though? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of he is the framework. Now here I'm thinking, so Maggie, I'm for a moment talking about the book here, right? Book Frodo, are we supposed to connect with Frodo? Yes and no. Are we supposed to relate to him? Are we supposed to find ourselves in Frodo? No, not unique. Again, it's not to say that Tolkien was against you connecting to or relating to any of the characters. But that's not fundamentally the storytelling function that it has. What I do think he was interested in managing is not the character as someone that we connect to and someone we relate to, but as the Hobbit viewpoint, as the framework from which we're looking at the world. So he gives us hobbits collectively as a way for us to connect to this strange world that we're seeing, this strange world that is full of big people, right? These big mythic epic figures walking around. And the hobbits are not like that. And so they are more at our level. But I really don't think that we are supposed to connect with the experience of Frodo. Like, for instance, I think that we are supposed to connect to the experience of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, right? Like we're supposed to connect with, and then Jane Austen plays all these games with that. It's one of her favorite things to play with. Like, to what extent do we enter into the perspective of Emma in Emma? But anyway, she's already in the early part of the 19th century kind of playing with the conventions of the ways in which we find ourselves to be there in the story with the characters. And that, no, I don't think that Tolkien envisioned us, that Frodo being that to us as we go through. Anyway, yeah, sorry. This is me not going off on a Jane Austen tangent, because I've just actually, like last week, finished my periodic reread of all of Jane Austen's novels, and I was so struck with like the progression of what she's doing from Pride and Prejudice up through Persuasion. It's so fascinating when you read them in order. But anyway.
I love tangents like that, though, because it gives us a different context, you know? So I think it's lovely to kind of pull from these different things when we're talking about concepts, because we know Lord of the Rings, we can talk about these characters, we get super excited about it. But it is nice when you can kind of compare it to these other things, too, and be like, look at this device here, look at this idea there, and how this is managed. So I'm fine with those Jane Austen tangents. They're great.
So I don't think I was wrong to leave the theater and say they've modernized it, right? I think they have modernized it. I think that they did make Strider relatable in a way, to which word I used to even just try to resist even existing. back in the old days, I've always hated that word because it's such a sloppy word. I still dislike it. I think it's a sadly imprecise word. But anyway, because it's one of those words that you're saying something. It's an adjective that applies to a character, but it's saying something about you. It's not saying something about them, right? And that's what bothers me about it. I find it a really
and incredibly subjective. So how are we?
Yeah, it's a super squishy word. So people say he's a relatable character as if they're saying something about the character, when what you're actually saying is something about yourself. I found myself able to relate to that character, because you'll find other people who didn't relate to that character, and they won't consider that character relatable for that reason. And so when you're saying, I think this character is a very relatable character, it sounds like you're saying something, but you're saying something about the character, but you're not saying something about the character. You're saying something about yourself. Anyway, that's what I always disliked about the word. But whatever. Point is, they clearly do make Strider a relatable character in this film, and it's successful. Like it's good, and it works in lots of ways. I
disagree with Edith here. I didn't think that he was like supposed to be a type or supposed to be flat, but I do feel like the films did try to give a bit more to it, to kind of, I don't know about round. I feel like Aragorn's more trajectory, but
one of the things that, and this actually, this is connected interestingly back to the discussion we were having about their choices, their editing choices in the film to make the first film more Frodo-centric and to take out some of those Aragorn interiority scenes, right? And, learning more about his character. We don't get any scenes like that in the book, right? And I mean, nothing. Like we never get a scene where we're just seeing Aragorn by himself, learning what he's thinking. We learn more about him, but we stick to the hobbits all the way through.
Yeah, but you don't have that thoughtful moment, the longing for his mother, the thoughts of death. We don't have any of that.
No, there's nothing like that to simply humanize Aragorn's experience in his own. I mean, it's not to say we never learn anything about him, right? But we're always seeing him from the outside in that way. And there are times when Tolkien invites us to wonder. One of the biggest example I'd give of this is the moment right when they're about to leave Rivendell. I was about to say we just talked about this in Exploring the Lord of the Rings. We just talked about this in Exploring the Lord of the Rings about 9 months ago. But it was super recent. But the scene when they're all literally sitting around outside on the steps waiting to leave. And Gandalf is still inside talking to Elrond. And he describes Aragorn sitting on the steps, just sitting and thinking. We don't know what he's thinking, right? We're not told what's in his head. It's just the fact that he's sitting there by himself in this very reflective stance. And then the narrator says, only Gandalf, maybe, knew what this moment meant to Aragorn. We're not told what the moment means to Aragorn, right? But we're told that it means something that almost nobody understands, that it's a huge, huge deal that nobody, so there are moments like that where Tolkien actively invites us to kind of imagine what is going on behind the surface, but he never just shows us what's going on behind the surface. So scenes like that one with the statue in, and the shards of Narsil in Rivendell is exactly the kind of scene. And then Aragorn talking about his own feelings and his own perspective is what we just don't get in the book. It's not to say that he's never humanized. It's not that we never learn, but it's all at secondhand. We have to do the work to kind of figure out what's going on with him.
I also think that so much of that character development is played so well based on actor choice, because Viggo Mortensen was recast, right? It was. I'm blanking on his name now.
I forget the name too. Who it was? That was.
Doesn't matter. It was somebody else,
yeah.
and he came in like 2 weeks after. He's a vampire.
Yeah. What movie was he using? Queen of the Damned. That's gonna bother me. Keep going.
Somebody will come up with it for us. Thanks.
Yeah, someone will come up with it.
But he came in like 2 weeks after Prince Photography had already started or something. But
yeah,
it just shows I don't know why they recast it. It's not like I was in that room, but it does show how a singular actor's performance can portray characters differently. Yeah. So clearly they had this guy whose name is just going to punch me in the face in a second. They had him, and it wasn't delivering whatever they needed to. And I do think there's something so incredible about Viggo Mortensen's performance, that Aragorn is subtle and soft, but strong and fierce. I mean, he just carries the depth of Aragorn, I think, so well. Stuart Townsend, thank you. Thank you, Madagog. That was really distracting me. I was surely going to say something profound, but I just think that Viggo Mortensen is an incredible actor, and that all came out in changing Aragorn's character, because he didn't change it, but he changed it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Yep. Yeah, no, and it's funny hearing him talk, and he was thrust into it. He had an afternoon to decide, and he hadn't read the books. But then when he was kind of going through it, he was like, "Oh, he's familiar with Volsungs and Saga of the Volsung," and he's like, "Okay, I kind of get what's going on here." And you're like, "Yeah, all right, let's do this."
Yeah, I love that he's just like nonchalantly familiar with Volsungs,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And wasn't it also his son that was basically like, "You have to do this," or "We're not friends
that's the story I remember. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so like going back to that again, the trajectory, right, of his character, and the non-weakness, right, of his decision, of his reluctance to be king. Think about where it places the locus of the drama in his character all the way through, right? To be king, and Maggie talked about high school dropout, right? Instead of looking like a high school dropout, he's being wise, he's being humble, but that's the wrong decision. He needs to step up, in fact, right? So what you have is men are weak and tend to be power hungry, but that doesn't mean that the solution is, so therefore, like, anybody who's a good person should totally not seek power. Because, actually, we kind of do need somebody to seek power, right? That has to happen.
It's kind of true of politics today anyway, right?
Exactly.
Like, you still want good people at the table.
Exactly, right. So I think I've long supported a premise that says the thing that should exclude people from being a presidential candidate is if they want to be president. But anyway, so we need only unwilling heroes in politics. I feel very strongly about this, but yeah. So the question of is he going to do the right thing, which is it becomes a really complicated situation, right? Because seeking power, being confident in the way that Boromir is confident at the beginning, that's not a good thing, right? It is good for him to resist that. And yet it is he must step up. He must step forward. It would be wrong for him not to do that. And so the way that Aragorn's character kind of navigates that, and I think his relationship with Boromir is one of the primary places where we see this being developed all the way through. The scene, which I think is a low-key, crucial scene for the development of Aragorn's character, is the one about the "I have seen the White City" scene with Boromir. When we're hearing Boromir's love for him, which of course it's such an important setup to their final conversation in Boromir's death scene, right? The "our people" moment, Maggie, that you were pointing to before, and how hard that hits in that moment. But that sense, the thing that Boromir has, Boromir's not just a jerk, right? He's not just a bad character. Right. The love and loyalty for his city that he has, his motivations are good all the way through. And Aragorn's choice to not pursue power is a good choice, morally speaking. But in doing so, he's failing to do what Boromir has done, right? And so the way that they set it up as, so here's Boromir and Aragorn, who kind of each start off with one half of the picture, right? Love for his people and civic duty and willingness to put himself out there and do the right thing. That's what Boromir's got, right? But he doesn't have the humility. He doesn't have the recognition of the weakness of men, right? And the unlikelihood of overcoming that, right? But Aragorn has that. He has that knowledge, but he's lacking in the other and failing in the other by not stepping forward and taking up his position he should have. So the way the two of them come together, and Aragorn there's a sense in which he becomes almost Boromir's heir, right? Like he's going to take over from Boromir. He's going to go save their people. He's going to go and accomplish what Boromir wanted to accomplish. And that's, I think, really just so beautifully done in the film. And it's what makes the death scenes so powerful and Aragorn's arc so interesting, which again I couldn't see until I could get over being offended by it. But it's that I think it's really fascinating how that gets handled.
It's just making me think about the other things we see as the films go on too. We get these lovely moments of Boromir and Faramir and building out him as a brother and as a beloved leader of his people and crazy father, but really loved by his father as well. And so getting the depth of that character later on, it feeds back into the import of how that moment hits in the end of the first one, because obviously we've rewatched it 37,000 times.
Right.
It all just builds. So the first time you watch it, you get one thing. The second time you watch it, you get something more. Then the special features come out. Then the extended editions come out. The way they built our viewing experience, I think, really capitalized on expanding those characters too. Right. So we got to digest so much more of their arcs and their sophistication with the rewatching.
Yeah.
And man, I was just thinking, also just going back to Aragorn's arc, we see him once he gets to Rohan and he starts interacting with Theoden and Theoden's decision as king. You start to see him kind of like, okay, wait, like if I was in charge, we'd be doing this stuff differently.
Right.
And it's interesting to see that transitions kind of start to happen.
That's great. And you just see him like getting really frustrated and wanting to do the thing, but he said he wasn't going to do the thing. So he just love that.
Yeah. And that, the way in which Theoden is, it's like simultaneously a negative and a positive, like role model for Aragorn, right? No, there's
It's an interesting way for the films to handle that transition of Aragorn's that development for him, because of course Theoden's very different in the books and the films, as well, and makes some very different choices. I hadn't considered how Theoden's arc in the films really influences Aragorn's.
No, I think that's it is. We probably shouldn't get into a whole analysis of Theoden, but yes, I agree. I think that's the way that Rohan, both like geographically and politically, serves as this middle ground, this transition from I'm the ranger in the wilderness who's turned away from being king to what we see, to I am in armor saying for Frodo, and it is not this day, right in front of the army, in the Return of the King. Yeah. I mean, it is really, really fascinating how they shape his story through that way. So yes, that's me not talking about that right now because we don't have time.
Right now, put a pin in that one.
Exactly.
We also can't start that with 6 minutes left. Like,
exactly.
Oh goodness.
Exactly.
We want to spend more time on that.
Yep.
I was also just thinking of different moments of Aragorn and Boromir and how their relationship shifts too. And the scene that really sticks out to me is after Gandalf falls in the Mines of Moria and Aragorn standing up, get them up, pushing them on. For pity's sake, you have this real clash of emotion versus action. And it's not like that's the moment we start to see Aragorn become the leader. I didn't feel this monumental shift, but it's just like further evidence of he's taking on this leadership, but he's not quite giving in to the emotion of men. There was an interesting stretch there.
Yeah, I did feel like there was quite a shift, at least when I saw it. And I remember thinking, okay, so like, you know, you have these slow-mo shots after Gandalf
and that ethereal voice.
Yeah, of just like Aragorn like watching and sort of slowly backing away. I just remember thinking part of what he's like, oh, okay, he's really sad Gandalf just died, but he's also like, oh, I'm in charge now, like I have to carry this and I'm not ready. Yeah, I feel like that was part of that moment.
Yeah, you know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of the beginning with him. Like that physical distance that I was talking about before between him and the hobbits in those early pre-Rivendell, but pre-Weathertop sequences, right? That is the moment when he becomes the leader. Gandalf has fallen, so now it's up to him. Gandalf was the leader before. Now he's the leader, and he knows he's the leader, and he has to do it. And the first thing we see him do is distancing himself again, emotionally distancing himself in that moment, right? And it's almost like we're back to chucking apples at people's heads again, you know. And again, I know there's kindness there, there is a connection there, but again, you can't see him. He's off screen. He's off screen and lobbing apples across from the other side of the hill. Or again, like that, what the conversation that precipitated that sequence, the apple in the face sequence, of, you know, him saying, we continue on, you've just had breakfast, right? We're not stopping again for another meal right away, is a light version of the get them up, you know, and let's keep going, and we can't stop to grieve over Gandalf's death. That kind of distance, that kind of, you know, I'm gonna walk 5 yards in front of you and expect you to follow me, kind of leadership role, does, it seems to me, kind of echo that. We don't see that for long. Like, he doesn't stay in that mode. Well, because we're almost immediately into Lorien, and so and that changes a lot of things after that. But yeah.
It's interesting. I do feel like the movies takes, you know, some of his, because there is some, you know, he's indecisive or doubting of his decisions in the book many times. It does kind of take that and ratchet it up to 11. But then there are times in the films, specifically at the end of Fellowship, where he's very sure of what to do next, which is go get Merry and Pippin. Was not
and to keep
sure
them together.
Yeah. That's the other moment that I would point to, of him figuring out, him taking, like, right after Moria is the first place where he's actually acting as the leader of the company. But that moment after Parthgalan, after the death of Boromir, and the breaking of the Fellowship, is where he's now beginning to act as a leader differently. I mean, that is definitely another important transition moment in his development as leader. And think of what it means. Like, think of how he is in that moment, that we will not leave, you know, Merry and Pippin to the torment of the orcs. He's doing both. I mean, we talked about like the Aragorn pole and the Boromir pole, right? The love versus humility, and he's doing them together, right? The hand of the fate of the bearer is in my hands no longer, right? I'm not gonna follow the ring. I'm turning away from the ring. So I'm doing my humility thing, right, that I was doing before. I'm still holding to that. But now I'm going to be an active leader but we're going to go find Merry and Pippin. I'm going to, like, the love and loyalty that Boromir had. Again, not to say that he never had any of it, but again, like, I think that we can see him and the path that he's going to take, right? That path of following Merry and Pippin is what is ultimately going to lead him, you know, to Minas Tirith and the crown.
Well, and it continues up into, you know, kicking Theoden in the gut and going to the gates of Mordor and saying, then we're going to buy him 10 minutes of time while we die. You know, we are going to sacrifice everything so Frodo gets a chance. I mean, he was prepared, and making ultimate sacrifices.
Exactly. The way in which, in the end, what being king means to him, right? When he is acclaimed and he is leading the armies and everything, and he has all the power there at the, almost all, he doesn't have the ring, but apart from, he has all the non-ring power and authority there at the end. And how does he use it? He subordinates his own good and all of their good to just try to help Frodo, right? Like, we're all gonna, my culminating act as king is to shoot for the role of best supporting actor, right? Like, it's all about Frodo. We're just going to try to help if we can. So, I think that's really, it's fascinating to see how they have that, how they work out that trajectory. And I do think that their choice, which I never would have thought I would be in support of, I think that their choice to make him a reluctant king plays into this really, really well and really, really effectively. And at the end of the day, does not, I think, undermine the ultimate position that he gets, like the place where he ends up. The place where he ends up is very similar to where he ends up in Tolkien, even to the point of sacrifice at the end. Phil was saying how many of those folks at the Black Gate even knew who Frodo was. Yeah, it's true. Though honestly, again, I love how they handle that. Notice, because he has two connections, right? First, there's the speech that he gives on horseback, when, the big, Men of the West speech, right, that he delivers. That's the speech to the army, right? Yeah. Then, when he's on foot, which I don't know why he dismounts. Riding your horse into battle probably would have been smarter. But anyway, he's dismounted, and he turns, and it's not to the army. It's just to Merry and Pippin and the and Legolas and Gimli, that he says for Frodo in this quiet voice. He's not shouting to the whole army, so we can see both the love and the loyalty, right? Both the the sort of the political side and the personal side. The way that they bring both those two together, I think is really exciting. It's really fun. Cool. Well, we are out of time. I think, I don't know if we finished talking about Aragorn's character, but that was good.
We didn't even get to Return of the King.
We didn't get to Return.
We're just...
No, and like Eowyn, I want to talk about that relationship. Yes, Arwen, and
I was wanting to talk about Arwen more, but we didn't get to it, and that's probably for the best.
And somebody did ask earlier, are we going to do this with all the characters? I feel like you can probably say yes to that, but we won't do only that for the next 6 months. Like, we'll probably interject a few episodes about other things. But
yes, we will. Yes, we will.
I feel like we're just going to talk about it spur.
But yeah, I mean, this is there are. I mean, look, there's no question. We're talking about adaptation. We're specifically interested in Tolkien adaptation. So, yeah, surprise, surprise, the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings fans, it's a kind of a foundation of this discussion here.
And it's also a film, I think I said this when we first started talking about it, it's also like one of the only films out there that gave us as comprehensive and intense of a behind-the-scenes access as we've ever had to anything.
Yes.
So not only do we have a story that we sat and watched and multiple versions of it, we also have so much about what went into it to create that is absolutely part of the storytelling now in so many people. And and there's so many filmmakers that it's this trilogy that got them into film, myself included. I didn't know film was a thing you could do until you watch some of those behind the scenes and figure out what the jobs are. And yeah, so all of that, just to say this is a pretty iconic trilogy for many, many reasons.
Yeah.
And works for adaptation and storytelling.
Totally. All right. So we'll be back. So we won't be broadcasting next week. I'm going to be out of town next week. I'm going to a convention, the ZenKaiCon convention down in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Stop, that's where I'm from, Corey.
I know. I'm going to your hometown to...
oh my God, have a whoopie pie for me.
Yeah, totally. There are some things that are important when you go down to Lancaster. We used to spend a lot of time in Lancaster when we lived in Delaware. But it's one of our favorite places to go.
Fun.
Yeah. Anyway, so...
2 weeks.
2 weeks. 2 weeks we'll be back at the end of March. And we'll see. Maybe we'll talk more Peter Jackson stuff. Maybe we'll shift back and talk about some Rings of Power stuff that's come out. We at some point we need to talk about the War of the Rohirrim too, which we haven't really talked about much. So I think that will be very interesting. I love some of the things that have been hearing about that. So
it was also mentioned here that we should talk about LOTR at some point.
Yeah.
I know that's massive, but like it's also an incredible adaptation. So maybe we just spend some time thinking about games too, and what adaptation in gaming is like. Because the Harry Potter ones just come out too, and I feel like that would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think we can talk about. It would be fun talking about both some specific stuff. I mean, the LOTR adaptation is phenomenal, but applying some of our analysis of adaptation to that context, I think would be really interesting. And from there, thinking about what this sort of tells us about games as an adaptation medium as well, I think would be
Yeah,
would be
at some point you'll have to share with us some, down the road, Return to Moria.
Yes.
Insight.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Forward to that. That has been so cool. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Druid's Fire. We'll definitely talk about seeing if we can get some of the LOTR folks on with us when we talk about LOTR later. That would be cool.
One of them's my cousin, so I'm pretty sure we can make that happen.
I didn't know that.
Did you not?
I did not.
My first published article was about LOTR because Dan let me into Turbine's offices and I got to interview everybody for like 3 days. It was great. And then I just sat and watched him play for about 12 hours and took notes.
Right.
Nice.
Cool. Neat. All right. Cool. Well, yeah. So we'll definitely get there. We'll definitely talk about that stuff too. So, awesome. Thanks everybody as always for joining us, and we will see you guys in a couple weeks. Thanks everybody. Bye now.
See ya.